The dogs and the fox. Some dogs found the skin of a lion and furiously began to tear at it with their teeth. A fox chanced to see them and laughed scornfully. If the lion had been alive, he said, it would have been a very different story. He would have made you feel how much sharper his claws are than your teeth. It is easy and also contemptible to kick a man that is down. The dogs and their hides. Some hungry dogs saw a number of hides at the bottom of a stream where the tanner had put them to soak. The fine hide made for an excellent meal for a hungry dog, but the water was deep, and the dogs could not reach the hides from the bank. So they held a council and decided that the very best thing to do was to drink up all the river. All fell to lapping up the water as fast as they could, but though they drank and drank until, one after another, all of them had burst with drinking, still, for all their effort, the water in the river remained as high as ever. Do not try and do impossible things. The rabbit, the weasel, and the cat. A rabbit left his home one day for a dinner of clover, but he forgot to latch the door of his house, and while he was gone, a weasel walked in and calmly made himself at home. When the rabbit returned, there was a weasel nose sticking out from the rabbit's own doorway, sniffing the fine air. The rabbit was quite angry, for a rabbit, and requested the weasel move out. But the weasel was perfectly content. He was settled down for good. A wise old cat heard the dispute and offered to settle it. "Come close to me," said the cat. "I'm very deaf. Put your mouths close to my ears while you tell me the facts." The unsuspecting pair did as they were told, and in an instant the cat had them both under her claws. No one could deny the dispute had been definitively settled. The strong are apt to settle questions to their own advantage. The bear and the bees. A bear roaming through the woods in search of berries happened on a fallen tree in which a swarm of bees had stored their honey. The bear began to nose around the log very carefully to find out if the bees were at home. Just then, one of the swarm came home from the clover field with a load of sweets. Guessing what the bear was after, the bee flew at him, stung him sharply, and then disappeared into the hollow log. The bear lost his temper in an instant and sprang upon the log, tooth and claw, to destroy the nest. But this only brought out the whole swarm. The poor bear had to take his heels, and he was able to save himself only by diving into a pool of water. It is wiser to bear a single injury in silence than to provoke 1,000 by flying into a rage. The fox and the leopard. A fox and a leopard, resting lazily after a generous dinner, amused themselves by disputing about their good looks. The leopard was very proud of his glossy spotted coat and made disdainful remarks about the fox, whose appearance he declared was quite ordinary. The fox prided himself on his fine bushy tail with its tip of white, but he was wise enough to see that he could not rival the leopard in looks. Still, he kept up a flow of sarcastic talk just to exercise his wits and have the fun of disputing. The leopard was about to lose his temper when the fox got up, yawning lazily. "You may have a very smart coat," he said, "but you would be a good deal better off if I had a little more smartness inside your head and less on your ribs, the way I am. That's the way I call real beauty." A fine coat is not always an indication of an attractive mind. The heron. A heron was walking sedately along the bank of a stream, his eyes on the clear water, and his long neck and pointed bill ready to snap up the likely morsels for breakfast. The clear water swarmed with fish, but Master Heron was hard to please that morning. "No small fry for me," he said. "Such scanty fare is not fit for a heron." Now, a fine young perch swam near. "No, indeed," said the heron. "I wouldn't even trouble to open my beak for anything like that." As the sun rose, the fish left, and the shallow water near the shore swam into the cold depths towards the middle. The heron saw no more fish, and very glad was he, at last, to breakfast on a tiny snail. Do not be too hard to suit, or you may have to be content with the worst, or with nothing at all. The Cock and the Fox. One bright evening, as the sun was sinking on a glorious world, a wise old cock flew into a tree to roost. Before he composed himself to rest, he flapped his wings 3 times and crowed loudly. But just as he was about to put his head under his wing, his beady eyes caught a flash of red and a glimpse of a long pointed nose, and there, just below him, stood Mr. Fox. "Have you heard the wonderful news?" cried the Fox, in a very joyous and excited manner. "What news?" asked the Cock very calmly. But he had a queer, fluttery feeling inside him, for, you know, he was very much afraid of the Fox. "Your family and mine and all the other animals have agreed to forget their differences and live in peace and friendship from now on forever. Just think of it! I cannot wait to embrace you. Do come down, dear friend, and let us celebrate the joyful event." "How grand!" said the Cock. "I certainly am delighted at the news." But he spoke in an absent way, and stretched up on tiptoes, seemed to be looking at something afar off. "What is it that you see?" asked the Fox a little anxiously. "Why, it looks like a couple of dogs coming this way. They must have heard the good news, and—" But the Fox did not wait to hear more. Off he started to run. "Wait!" cried the Cock. "Why do you run? The dogs are your friends now." "Yes," answered the Fox, "but they might not have heard the news. Besides, I have a very important errand that I had almost entirely forgotten about." The Cock smiled as he buried his head and his feathers and went to sleep, for he had succeeded in outwitting a very crafty enemy. The trickster is easily tricked. The Dog in the Manger. A dog, asleep in a manger filled with hay, was awakened by the cattle, which came in tired and hungry from working in the field. But the dog would not let them get near the manger, and snarled and snapped as if it was filled with the best of meat and bones, all for himself. The cattle looked at the dog in disgust. "How selfish he is," said one. "He cannot eat the hay, and yet he will not let us eat it who are so hungry for it." Now the farmer came in. When he saw how the dog was acting, he seized a stick and drove him out of the stable, with many a blow for his selfish behavior. Do not grudge others what you cannot enjoy yourself. The Wolf and the Goat. A hungry wolf spied a goat browsing at the top of a steep cliff where he could not possibly get her. "That is a very dangerous place for you," he called out, pretending to be anxious about the goat's safety. "What if you should fall? Please listen to me and come down. Here you can get all you want of the finest, tenderest grass in the country." The goat looked over the edge of the cliff. "How very anxious you are about me," she said, "and how generous you are with your grass. But I know you, and it's your own appetite you're thinking of, not mine." An invitation prompted by selfishness is not to be accepted. The Ass and the Grasshoppers. One day, as an ass was walking into the pasture, he found some grasshoppers chirping merrily in a grassy corner of the field. He listened with a great deal of admiration to the song of the grasshoppers. It was such a joyful song that his pleasure-loving heart was filled with a wish to sing as they did. "What is it," he asked very respectfully, "that has given you such beautiful voices? Is there a special food you eat, or some divine nectar that makes you sing so wonderfully?" "Yes," said the grasshoppers, who were very fond of a joke. "It's the dew we drink. Try some and see." So after the ass would eat nothing and drink nothing but dew, naturally, the poor foolish ass soon died. The laws of nature are unchangeable. The Mule. A mule had a long rest and much good feeling. He was feeling very vigorous indeed, and pranced about loftily, holding his head high. "My father certainly was a full-blooded racer," he said. "I can feel that distinctly." The next day he was put into a harness again, and that evening He was very downhearted indeed. "I was mistaken," he said. "My father was an ass after all." Be sure of your pedigree before you boast of it. The Fox and the Goat. A fox fell into a well, and though it was not very deep, he found that he could not get out again. After he had been in the well for a long time, a thirsty goat came by. The goat thought that the fox had gone down to drink, and so he asked if the water was good. "Ah, the finest in the whole country," said the crafty fox. "Jump in and try it. There is more than enough for both of us." The thirsty goat immediately jumped in and began to drink. The fox, just as quickly, jumped out on the goat's back and leaped to the tip of the goat's horn out of the well. The foolish goat now saw what a plight he had gotten into, and begged the fox to help him out. But the fox was already on his way to the woods. "If you had as much sense as you have beard, old fellow," he said as he ran, "you would have been more cautious about finding your way to get out before you jumped in. Look before you leap." The Cock, the Cat, and the Young Mouse. A very young mouse, who had never seen anything of the world, almost came to grief the very first time he ventured out. And this is the story he told his mother about his adventures. "I was strolling along very peaceably when, just as I turned the corner into the next yard, I saw two strange creatures. One of them had a very kind and gracious look, but the other was the most fearful monster you could imagine. You should have seen him. On top of his head and in front of his neck hung pieces of raw red meat. He walked about restlessly, tearing up the ground with his toes and beating his arms savagely against his sides. The moment he caught sight of me, he opened his pointed mouth as if to swallow me, and then a loud, piercing roar came out that almost frightened me to death." Can you guess who it was that the young mouse was trying to describe to his mother? It was nobody but the barnyard cock, and the first one the little mouse had ever seen. "If it had not been for that terrible monster," the mouse went on, "I should have made the acquaintance of a pretty creature who looked so good and gentle. And to think, velvety fur, and a meek face, and a look that was very modest, though his eyes were bright and shining. As he looked at me, he waved his fine long tail and smiled. I am sure he was just about to speak to me when the monster I told you about let out a screaming yell, and I ran for my life." "My son," said the mother mouse, "that gentle creature you saw was none other than the cat. Under his kindly appearance, he bears a grudge against every one of us. The other was nothing but a bird who wouldn't harm you in the least. As for the cat, he eats us. So be thankful, my child, you escaped with your life, and as long as you live, never judge people by their looks. Do not trust alone to outward appearances." The Wolf and the Shepherd. A wolf had been prowling around a flock of sheep for a long time, and the shepherd watched very anxiously to prevent him from carrying off a lamb. But the wolf did not try to do any harm. Instead, he seemed to be helping the shepherd take care of the sheep. At last, the shepherd got so used to seeing the wolf about, he forgot how wicked he could be. One day, he even went so far as to leave his flock at the wolf's care while he went on an errand. But when he came back, he saw how many of the flock had been killed and carried off, and he knew how foolish it had been to trust a wolf. Once a wolf, always a wolf. The Peacock and the Crane. The Peacock and the Crane. A peacock, puffed up with vanity, met a crane one day, and to impress him, spread his glorious tail in the sun. "Look," he said, "what have you to compare to this? I am dressed in all the color of the rainbow, while your feathers are gray as dust." The crane spread his broad wings and flew up toward the sun. "Follow me if you can," he said, but the peacock stood where he was among the birds of the barnyard, while the crane soared in freedom far up into the blue sky. The useful is of much more importance and value than the ornamental. The Farmer and the Cranes. Some cranes saw a farmer plowing a large field. When the work of plowing was done, they patiently watched him sow the seed. It was their feast, they thought. Soon, As the farmer had finished planting and had gone home, down they flew to the field and began to eat as fast as they could. The farmer, of course, knew the cranes and their way. He had experience with such birds before. He soon returned to the field with a sling, but he did not bring any stones with him. He expected to scare the cranes just by swinging the sling in the air and shouting loudly at them. At first, the cranes flew away in great terror, but they soon began to see that none of them ever got hurt. They did not even hear the noise of the stones whizzing through the air, and as for the words, well, they would kill nobody. At last, they paid no attention whatsoever to the farmer. The farmer saw that he would have to take other measures. He wanted to save at least some of his grain, so he loaded his sling with stones and killed several of the cranes. This had the effect the farmer wanted. From that day on, the cranes visited his field no more. Bluff is no proof that hard fists are lacking. The Farmer and His Sons. A rich old farmer who felt he had not many more days to live called his sons to his bedside. "My sons," he said, "heed what I have to say to you. Do not on any account part with the estate that has belonged to our family for so many generations. Somewhere on it is hidden a rich treasure. I don't know the exact spot, but it is there, and you will surely find it. Spare no energy, and leave no spot unturned in your search." The father died, and no sooner was he in his grave than the sons began to work, digging with all their might, turning up every foot of ground with their spades, and going for the whole farm 2 or 3 times. No hidden gold did they find, but at harvest time, when they had settled their accounts and had pocketed a rich profit, far greater than any of their neighbors, they understood that the treasure their father had told them was about the wealth and bounty of a crop, and that their industry was their treasure. Industry is itself the treasure. The 2 pots. 2 pots, one brass and the other of clay, stood together on the hearthstone. One day, the brass pot proposed to the earthen pot that they go out into the world together, but the earthen pot excused himself, saying that it would be wise for him to stay in the corner by the fire. "It would take so little to break me," he said. "You know how fragile I am. The least shock is sure to shatter me." "Don't let that keep you at home," urged the brass pot. "I shall take every good care of you. If we should happen to meet anything hard, I will step between and save you." So the earthen pot at last consented, and the 2 set out side by side, jolting along on 3 stubby legs. The earthen pot could not survive that sort of companionship for very long. They had not gone 10 paces before the earthen pot cracked, and at the next jolt flew into 1,000 pieces as he hit the ground. Equals make the best friends. The Goose and the Golden Egg. There was once a countryman who possessed the most wonderful goose you could imagine, for every day he visited the nest, the goose had laid a beautiful, glittering, golden egg. The countryman took the eggs to the market and soon began to get rich. But it was not long before he grew impatient with the goose, because she only gave him a single golden egg a day. He was not getting rich fast enough. Then, one day, after he had finished counting his money, the idea came to him that he could get all the golden eggs at once by killing the goose and cutting it open. But when the deed was done, not a single golden egg did he find, and his precious goose was dead. Those who have plenty want more, and so lose all that they have. The Frightening Bulls and the Frog. 2 bulls were fighting furiously in a field, at one side of which was a marsh. An old frog living in the marsh trembled as he watched the fierce battle. "What are you afraid of?" asked a young frog. "Do you not see," replied the old frog, "that the bull who is beaten will drive the other away from the good forage up there to the reeds and down to this marsh, and we shall be trampled into the mud?" It turned out, as the frog had said. The beaten bull was driven to the marsh, where he and his great hoofs crushed the frogs to death. When the great fall out, it is the weak who must suffer for it. The Mouse and the Weasel. A little hungry mouse found his way one day into a basket of corn. He had to squeeze himself a good deal to get through the narrow opening between the strips of the basket, but When the corn was tempting, the mouse was determined to get in. When at last he had succeeded, he gorged himself to bursting. Indeed, he became about 3 times as big around the middle as he was when he went in. At last, he felt satisfaction and dragged himself to the opening to get out again. But the best he could do was to get his head out. So there he sat, groaning and moaning, but from discomfort inside him and his anxiety to escape from the basket. Just then a weasel came by. He understood the situation quickly. "My friend," he said, "I know what you've been doing. You've been stuffing. And that's what you get. You will have to stay there till you feel like you did when you went in. Good night, and good enough for you." And that was all the sympathy the poor mouse got. Greediness leads to misfortune. The Farmer and the Snake. A farmer walked through the field one cold winter morning. On the ground lay a snake, stiff and frozen with cold. The farmer knew how deadly the snake could be, and yet he picked it up and put it to his bosom to warm it back to life. The snake soon revived, and when he had enough strength, bit the man who had been so kind to it. The bite was deadly, and the farmer felt that he must die. As he drew his last breath, he is said to have said to those standing around, "Learn from my fate. Do not take pity on a scoundrel." The Sick Stag. A stag had fallen sick. He had just strength enough to gather some food and find a quiet clearing in the woods. When he lay down to wait until his strength should return, the animals heard about the stag's illness and came to ask after his health. Of course, they were all hungry and helped themselves freely to the stag's food, and as you would expect, the stag soon starved to death. Goodwill is worth nothing unless it is accompanied by good acts. The Goatherd and the Wild Goats. One cold, stormy day, a goatherd drove his goats from shelter into a cave, where a number of wild goats had also found their way. The shepherd wanted to make the wild goats part of his flock, so he fed them well, but to his own flock he gave only just enough food to keep them alive. When the weather cleared and the shepherd led the goats out to feed, the wild goats scampered off to the hills. "Is that the thanks I get for feeding you and treating you so well?" complained the shepherd. "Do not expect us to join your flock," replied one of the wild goats. "We know how you would treat us later on, if some strangers should come, as we did." It is unwise to treat old friends badly for the sake of new ones. The Spendthrift and the Swallow. A young fellow who was very popular among his boon companions as a good spender quickly wasted his fortune trying to live up to his reputation. Then, one fine day in early spring, he found himself with not a penny left and no property save for the clothes he wore. He was to meet some jolly young men that morning, and he was at his wits' end on how to get enough money to keep up appearances. Just then a swallow flew by, twittering merrily, and the young man, thinking summer had come, hastened off to a clothes dealer, to whom he sold all the clothes he wore, down to his very tunic. A few days later, a change in the weather brought a severe frost, and the poor swallow, that the foolish young man in his light tunic, and with his arms up and knees bare, could scarcely keep life in them with their shivering bodies. One swallow does not make a summer. The Cat and the Birds. A cat was growing very thin. As you could have guessed, he did not get enough to eat. One day he heard that some birds in the neighborhood were ailing and needed a doctor. So he put on a pair of spectacles and, with a leather box in his hand, knocked on the door of the birds' home. The birds peeped out, and Dr. Cat, with much solicitude, asked how they were. He would be very happy to give them some medicine. "Tweet, tweet," laughed the birds. "Very smart, aren't you? We are very well, thank you, and more so if you only keep away from here. Be wise and shun the quack." The Dog and the Oyster. There was once a dog who was very fond of eggs. He visited the henhouse very often, and at last got so greedy that he would swallow the eggs whole. One day the dog wandered down to the seashore. He had spied an oyster. In a twinkling, the oyster was resting in the dog's stomach, shell and all. It pained the dog a great deal, as you could guess. "I've learned that all round things are not eggs," he said, groaning. "Act in haste and repent at leisure, and often in pain."